Welcome everyone to our conversation with film director Marcel Arteaga and immigration attorney Carlos Spector. Since the conversation is via Zoom webinar, all attendees are in listen-only mode and only speakers will be able to share video. If you run into technical problems or have a question, please reach out using the Zoom chat. The lecture portion of the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on our class YouTube page. Those who wish to participate in the Q&A should join the webinar. The link to join will automatically appear when you register, as the Q&A session will not be live streamed. All webinar attendees will be muted throughout the webinar, but can send questions via the Q&A button throughout the webinar, and Professor Vivian Braids will moderate those questions. Here at Stanford, we are in the land and territory of the Ohlone original peoples. We offer gratitude to the land, water, and air that surrounds us and pay our respect to the past, present, and future Ohlone and Lenape peoples who continue to be present in their homelands and throughout their diasporas. We encourage you to learn about and support indigenous communities and their struggles in Latin America and the US. We will start the event with a trailer of the documentary film El Guardián de la Memoria, The Guardian of Memory. I would like to let everyone know that the film will begin its virtual release in art house cinemas and cultural centers across the US tomorrow, October 23rd. For more information, please visit the website epfmedia.com or theguardianofmemory.com.
Cuando murió me rompieron todo el miedo que fuera.
Asesinados, encobijados, empezaron a aparecer muertos.
Esta es la lista de las
O
personas.
sea, se acabó la tranquilidad.
En veces mis pesadillas no
Vi
paran.
las piezas de mis hijos.
¿O qué le dije? ¿Ya los mataste?
Nos vamos a chingar a todos.
Ay, me
La
los
cara cubierta como cobardes.
Generalmente la corrupción era dentro de los cuerpos policíacos y en el Estado en México. Ahora tiene su subcontratista, se llama cartel.
No tiene sentido que en el momento que hay 3,000 soldados cuidando el Valle Juárez es cuando los violentos les da por matar gente.
Nos andaban buscando a todos, el crimen organizado y la policía en conjunto.
No hay crimen organizado, porque el crimen organizado no existe sin la complicidad del Estado a nivel local, estatal o federal. Ese es el crimen autorizado, donde el Estado y los empresarios han permitido, a través de la impunidad, el control del pueblo por los criminales. La impunidad no es una consecuencia de la violencia, es la política de la violencia.
Welcome again. Before I introduce film director Marcel Arteaga and immigration attorney Carlos Spector, I would like to thank EPF Media for sponsoring this event and Vivian Braids for moderating today's conversation. Vivian Braids is lecturer at Stanford University. She worked for several years as a human rights observer and election monitor with the United Nations and the Organization of American States in Haiti, Dominican Republic, Venezuela, and Guatemala, and was an advocate and lobbyist in Washington, D.C. She has worked at Stanford since 2005 And her volunteer work and engagement includes the Prison University Project, teaching Spanish at the San Quentin Prison, the Immigration Institute of the Bay Area, preparing immigrants for the U.S. citizenship exam, and at the Dili Pro Bono Project in Texas and Al Otro Lado in Tijuana, Mexico, helping asylum seekers articulate their fear of return claims. Furthermore, Vivian has focused on developing meaningful partnerships with some of these organizations to offer students real-life experiences with Spanish-speaking communities to raise awareness about other cultures and their own, grow their intercultural skills, and develop identities as engaged citizens. Thank you, Vivian, for accepting to moderate the panel today. And now I will introduce our speakers. Film director Marcela Arteaga graduated from Mexico's prestigious Center for Cinematography Education of the National Center for the Arts. Recuerdos, Remembrance, her first feature documentary film, received support from the Rockefeller Foundation and received the International Federation of Film Critics, FIPRESI Prize, for Best Mexican Film at the Guadalajara International Film Festival, the Jury's Special Award at the Malaga International Film Festival, the Guanajuato International Film Festival, and was nominated for Best Documentary Film at the Mexican Academy Awards. Marcela's most recent film, and the one she will be discussing today, El Guardián de la Memoria, The Guardian of Memory, has been awarded several accolades, and just last month was awarded the Ariel for Best Documentary Film at the Mexican Academy Awards. Thank you, Marcela, for joining us today to discuss your latest film. And Carlos Spector, who is featured in the film Guardian of Memory, is an immigration attorney. He enlisted in the U.S. Air Force after high school and served most of his time in Germany. After an honorable discharge, the El Paso native spent 1 year in an Israeli kibbutz and returned home to enroll at the University of Texas at El Paso, where he honed his analytical skills that led to his decision to pursue a law degree. Throughout the years, he has participated with several civil and immigration rights groups, such as the League of United Latin American Citizens and the Texas Latino Jewish Alliance, and he co-founded Mexicanos en Exilio. His work has been honored by many human rights organizations and featured now in 2 Academy Award Mexican documentaries, as well as in Mexican and Canadian doctoral dissertations. Thank you, Carlos, for joining us today to discuss Marcela's film and your work as an immigration attorney in the El Paso Juarez region. And now, with no further ado, we can start the conversation with Marcela and Carlos. Vivian, please welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It is such a pleasure to introduce the Guardian of Memory and our guests, Director Marcela Arteaga and immigration lawyer Carlos Spector. I'm really looking forward to our time here together. I have already been using a 15-minute segment of this beautiful and powerful documentary for my advanced Spanish class, Migration, Asylum, and Human Rights at the Border, which is a preparation to work directly with migrants in detention. For the last couple of years, at the end of the quarter, I would take my students to work inside a family detention center in Dili, Texas on 14, 15-hour-long days, helping asylum seekers articulate their fear of return claims with the asylum officer. We listened to hundreds of horrific stories like the ones portrayed in the movie. Since the pandemic, I adapted the class on the current circumstances, and we are signed up to receive calls of detained immigrants through hotlines of 2 organizations, one connected to more than 100 immigration prisons in this country, the other one with just 1 organization in San Diego. I love this documentary to prepare students on the complexity of the immigration crisis, because it connects us with those stories of migrants, with all our senses, our emotions, and also intellectually. It provides a clear explanation of authorized crime in Mexico that in normal times should be a strong legal basis in our courts for asylum relief, withholding of deportation, or removal under the Convention Against Torture. First, I would like to get some stories from Director Marcel Arteaga and Immigration Attorney Carlos Spector. Then I will follow with some more questions, depending on where the conversation leads us. And I would also love to include the audience. Please send us your questions. So I'll start with Marcela. I would like to start by asking you to share the story of how this documentary came about and how you met Carlos Spector.
Okay. Well, I started to think about, well, the first thing that happened to me was that I was very angry and very indignada. How do you say that in English? About what was going on in Mexico, all the violence and the official the way they were trying to convince us that the war that Calderon was driving in Mexico was between the cartels, and you always know in Mexico we have this maybe it's not a good thing, but we never trust in authorities. So I thought that something was not going all right, and I was very angry, and I said I had to do something. We have to do something. This cannot be like this, like forever, and we doing nothing. And the only thing, the tools that I have to do something is my filmmaking, because that's the only thing I know how to do. And at the same time, I met Carlos in Mexico because I am a close friend of his favorite cousin, and so I met him in Mexico. And when I started to listen what he was telling to all these lawyers in Mexico, they were talking about migration, but he was speaking about Mexican. He was the only one who doesn't live in Mexico, and the only one who knew about Mexican migration. The other ones, the Mexicans, knew about Central American migrants or migration, but not Mexican ones. So, and when I listened to him speaking about this authorized crime, all the pieces of the puzzle that I had just fell down, and I said, well, I have to do a documentary film about him and what he's doing, and about all these stories and Mexican migration, because in Mexico we don't know anything about Mexican migration. And that's how I started.
Thank you, Marcela. There is an open and authentic vulnerability in your participants throughout the documentary that touch us at very different levels. Marcela, can you tell us how you collected these stories and how you decided which ones to weave into your movie?
Which one is a very difficult way. It's a very difficult decision to make, because all of them are very important. All of them are very I mean, you cannot decide on which one is worse than the other one, because they are all very sad ones and very tragic, and it's inimaginable what you listen. And so we had to decide not in terms of the tragedies, but in terms of what was best for the film. But even with that in mind, what I wanted to say, it was that this is not organized crime, but authorized crime. So we had to show the people that what happened. The stories begins with somebody that was there and with no reason apparently. That's Rosa's story. Her sons were a Sunday evening after having dinner, they went to the park and the tragedy started there. They were just going to the park to have some fun with the kids, and it started in a huge tragedy. So, and that's an example of a family, normal family in Mexico, going to the park in Juarez and ended up dead. And then the next story is about, involves the police, the next one, the federal police, and the next one, the military, the army. So that's how we choose the stories. It started it's not the less important, but something that apparently doesn't have anything with the authorities. And that's how I choose which stories to take. And how did I approach them? They are all clients of Carlos' clients. So that's how and they were all willing to tell their stories. They at the beginning they were afraid because they still have family in Mexico, but then they understood that it was very important for them and for their families, their tragedies, for everyone to know what happened to them and what is going on in Mexico.
Thank you. Carlos, please. First, could you explain the concept of authorized crime and why it should be so relevant for many displaced, fleeing migrants, families, to use as a legal basis in our courts to seek political asylum under the international framework of protections for refugees? And could you give us some examples of how effective it has been or not in your experience?
Well, I first heard of the concept of authorized crime maybe 8-9 years ago from the mouth of victims of authorized crime. That is to say, Honduran women from Central America in the south of Mexico describing the Mexican immigration officials in the trains coming north. And from the very beginning, when I was reading an article, and I forget the leader of this Honduran woman, but she's a well-known activist for many years. And she was able to articulate in 2 words what I couldn't and many other scholars couldn't explain in books or in discussions or presentations. She had branded the means of committing atrocities in Mexico and throughout Latin America with just 2 words, which captured it. And anytime you use the term authorized crime, everybody's lights, everybody's eyes shine with the aha moment where I understand. And what is it that they understand? Is that they feel that the impunity, the lack of accountability in Mexico, and is what is responsible for the violence. If the violence does not occur at a state, local, or federal level without the acquiescence or active participation of the government. So authorized crime really, for me, became a way of politically explaining what was happening in Mexico. And especially in the small towns from which many of my clients came from and from which many of the people from Guadalupe uh, uh, came from, the small town of Guadalupe where most of the people in the film are from. That's my mother's hometown. My grandfather was the presidente municipal during the Lázaro Cárdenas period, and I would spend my summers there. So I was familiar with the town, and so when people would describe what was happening, uh, uh, there was never a question as to why it was happening, because they were able to articulate. Well, the mayor is the head of the cartel. The police is a member of the other cartel, and so just having the ability to in real time analyze the characters and the social and political forces in a small town was a way of applying a small analysis of a laboratory of violence to the broader society, which is Mexico. Now, where I like it and I've used it in immigration cases is that it really tries to fill the gap in asylum law wherein 98% of Mexican asylum and to a large degree Central American cases are being denied. And in Mexico, I've tracked the statistics, and for maybe 30 years, year after year after year, the denial rate in the mid 90s, upper 90s, or denial rates continued, no matter who the president was, no matter the conditions. The only thing that was a stable factor was the U.S. government's denial of the of Mexican asylum claims, no matter how horrendous. There was a prejudicial application of the law by ex-deportation officers who become judges, and a continuing need of the U.S. government to not embarrass at a foreign policy level of a Mexican government incapable of handling the human rights situation. And so to prove an asylum claim, you have to show that you're being persecuted on account of race, religion, national origin, or political opinion. Now, if you're not eligible for that, then you may be eligible for the Convention Against Torture, where all we have to prove is that the state acquiesced, permitted the violence to occur. And all my clients were victims of the state, what directly or indirectly. So authorized crime, even to the judges, was a way of making the connection between the state and the cartels to show that this didn't happen in Guadalupe, for example, in a town where the police officer had 3 bullets in his gun. He had maybe 1 assistant, and they had no resources. Combating a cartel with 50 men armed with rifles, who had most of the police on the force over the years. And so there was no way that the local government wasn't aware of the role of the cartel in controlling the government and not vice versa, as well as the business leaders in that community acquiescing to it by paying bribes or actually being part of the cartels in one way or the other. And that went all the way up to the cartel, to the governor, who at the time was Duarte, who's now being extradited from the U.S. And so it became a way of presenting reality in both a judicial and political sense, which has become more popularized through Marcela's characterization of it by interviewing these individuals who were all victims of authorized crime. The level of involvement of the state always varies. What does not vary is the relationship between the cartel and the government.
Thank you, Carlos. One more question. Under the current administration, we have seen the dismantling of the immigration system. More than 400 executive actions, measures, technical adjustment, etc., directed both towards the southern border and interior enforcement. Just to name a few, travel bans, metering, MPP or remain in Mexico, separation of families, safer country, many attempts to end DACA, etc. They are all designed to block the vast majority of asylum seekers' access or eligibility. More recently, the pandemic has given the administration further opportunities to close off the border. Let's imagine the best case scenario for the upcoming elections, that we flip both the Senate and the executive. What are the hopes or expectations of improvement when the Obama-Biden administration during the first couple of years, holding both houses, was not even able to pass the DREAM Act? Although we can all agree that the situation is much worse now, the Family Detention Center, or as it is called, the baby jail, where I took my students in previous years, was created in 2014 under Obama. Are there any reasons to be more hopeful now that we could put an end to mass incarcerations, mass deportations, and mass impoverishing?
Well, I'm hopeful in the sense that there's a new generation of activism and of scholars who understand that the problems we have are not legislative, but systemic problems. The Black Lives Movement is critical in having brought that critical analysis of their problems before. The same exists in the immigration context. Systemic racism, systemic xenophobia is part of the American DNA. It's not an aberration. It's represented by 46 to 48% of the people today, and always hidden there, ready to come forth when called upon by the appropriate rising despot or racist or fascist. And so I think that what we need to start doing, and I think that's what Mexicano in Exilio has done and tried to do, is that our critique and our creation of Mexicanos in Exilio was to deal with the institutional problems in two countries simultaneously, because we live on the border, we live in the twilight zone. And so the only way to deal with both countries was to really to look at what was happening systemically. Very few nonprofits, when I started doing this with Sandra, my compañera, in 2008, when Calderon came to, in March of 2008, came to Chihuahua, was not to take individual cases. I'm a solo practitioner and have been most of my life. But the idea was we can't handle everything, but what we need to do is handle this systemically and try to address a systemic problem. And the systemic problem was authorized crime, the relationship between the state and criminality. But we couldn't do every case. So what we decided to do is basically say, well, let's help those who help others. let's help those whose impact could whose representation could have a big impact. So we started defending newspaper or reporters, human rights activists, and social activists. And for us, the social activists were by and large Mexican women looking for the disappeared or seeking to file a police report or a claim for their disappeared or murdered or extorted family members. And so on that basis, we started selecting it. And what I found out pretty quick is that a solo practitioner had more Mexican asylum claims than all the nonprofits in Texas together. Why? Because they had bought the American government's position that unless Mexicans are involved in civil war, then Mexicans are not entitled to asylum claims because it is the epitome of democracy in Latin America and because historically asylum law has developed around the issue of state terror, beginning with the Holocaust and beginning with some of the Stalinist persecutions coming out of the Soviet Union and Argentina and other states where the government was totally in control. So in the absence of civil war, there was a belief that that there was no crime against individuals on the basis of, for example, of political opinion. That most of it was by the private actor. But when the private actor in a failed state or in a regionally failed state becomes the primary actor with the support, acquiescence, the permission of the government, then you have a claim. But the reality of the origins of asylum work and law does not plug into the reality that faces most of the world. And so I think we needed to come up with a new language, and that was authorized crime. And so I think that to a degree, finally, I'll say that one of the problems, I was the national chair of the LULAC Immigration Task Force in 84 5 during the first amnesty program. And what I've noticed over the years is that the immigrant rights movement has always been divided by those who do legal work and those who organize, but never the two shall meet. And that's always been the dividing point, that if you get engaged in legal work, you get lost in it, but you're doing good things, you're doing God's work because you're saving a human being. But ultimately, it's a never-ending tsunami. So that's why we also chose the cases we could win. It's like being a good manager for a good boxer. If you pit him against the best, you're going to lose a whole lot of fights. So if they're denying 98% of the cases, then they're telling you there's a 98% chance of losing. And we would even lose some of the toughest, best cases we've had. So in order to be able to say, sí se puede, and to organize the Mexican community by educating them that people are winning their cases and that there are human rights violations in Mexico and that there are abuses in the United States, to try to avoid the basic problem we have, which is Mexico expels Mexicans and the US incarcerates. And so what we did with Mexicanos en Exilio is to create an organization when they come running from Mexico and they haven't filed a police claim, then then expulsion represents an estate vow. So we would demand that the Mexican government take the cases, and then when they get here, to try to get them a work permit, to get them some stability, to get them to deal with their trauma, to get them to deal with the arriving Mexicans and exiles who have faced the same thing. And that's without getting any money or foundation from any organization to date. Where do we get it from? From las ganas, from the will of these people and their labor. And we do the work for free, by and large. And as a result of that, we have tried to develop a model of asylum and immigration rights systemic work of looking at the problem a little broader and not get inundated.
Thank you, Carlos. Marcela, the movie plays with beautiful and impactful images of abandoned cities, desolated landscapes, water and fire, household objects left behind, artfully displayed on the sand. How did you come up with that visual texture?
Well, that's the way I do movies. My prior film, it's the same. I have a chair and something else, other objects. So how I start is by imagining in the first place which objects or which scenes or what images I want to see that gives us an example by not telling, by not explaining with words the feelings and the emotions that people have. So that's how I start to imagine and to come up with these things, with these objects. And the puppet house, the small house, it's for me, it's the roots that you always have with you, your home, if you are an exile or if you have to move, it doesn't matter. You always take your home with you and your roots. And that's an explanation. And also the house, the things that are all in the desert. What I wanted to to say is that it's not a random thing. What is going on in Mexico and the violence is not a random thing. It's something that is like calculated and organized, and maybe it's not, as Carlos says in the movie, it's not a round table where people are businessmen and authorities are like chatting and saying, oh, let's do this or that. Maybe it's not like that, but it's systematic and it's organized. It's not random. So that's how that's how I imagine these things, and how like the more important things that I want to transmit in the film, and how can I do it without speaking or without an explanation, which the people telling their stories, it's a way, but there are other ways to do it, and I think that's a shorter way to get to the audience. I mean, it's like very direct, and you leave the audience to imagine whatever they want to and to feel whatever they want to, not by giving them the food, comida en la boca.
Thank you. All that imagery evocates the nostalgia for the world lost, ideas of memory and forgetting, the contrast of long silences and courageous voices and powerful stories. Can you talk about the title, The Guardian of Memory, un título evocador? What do we need to remember? And I'm asking this because you don't have any images of decapitated bodies or shootings. How do we need to remember and retell these stories?
Well, as you say, it's nostalgic. Everything's nostalgic because that's the feeling that I get from the people that are now living in the United States. They didn't want to be there. They didn't want to move or leave their homes, and they had to. So I think the main feeling is nostalgia. It's a That's how it is. And the title, first, I thought that Carlos was the guardian of memory because of what he's doing. He's like, recopilando all these stories that are going to stay forever in, I hope forever in the memory of everyone. And if you want to know what happened, then you only have to go to Carlos' office and ask, and they will tell you, or they will have everything there. So I thought he was the guardian of memory. But when I was interviewing one of the characters that appear in the film, he said to me that we are the guardians of memories. And he said to me, I am telling you this story, but you keep it and you tell it to other ones, for this story will never be forgot. Para que nunca se les olvide. So that was a very nice thing while we were doing the film, because we realized that we were all, including the audience, the guardians of memory.
Thank you, Marcela. And Carlos, you talk about your experience of being Jewish in Mexico. My parents survived Nazism and escaped communism in Romania. They lived in Israel, France, and settled in Argentina where I was born and raised. Migration and the memories of the Holocaust through the stories of my parents, and I may say your parents, our parents, are in our blood. How does this define your purpose in life?
Well, I think that this dual soul, I think I should say that I have a Jewish soul and a Mexican spirit, and passports in the United States and in Mexico. And I'm a Vietnam era veteran who went to a black law school. And so I think that it plays a big role in my identity and my quest for identity. Because when you are someone like Obama of mixed blood, you always have to prove yourself to the other. For you are embraced by both and rejected by both. And so at a very early age, you learn to distinguish between good people and bad people. Very simple. Some of the fathers of Brooklyn Jew who fought in Israel in 48, was in World War II, Russian descendants. My mother was from Guadalupe. Brooklyn Jew ends up there. It's a whole different story, but they get together and they marry. For much of the Jewish community, I'm what you call a mamzer, a bastard. And for many in el pueblo de Guadalupe era el judío. O si no el judío, el hijo del judío, the son of the Jew. And so as a result of that, there was always a sense of being the other, but still being loved by both of my parents and by great people in both communities. So you just needed to understand that. But you know, one of the most important developments in my early life was that my father was a cultural Jew. He wasn't a religious Jew. And he was a tough Jew. He was a federal police officer, black belt, and his only friends in El Paso were Holocaust survivors. And I felt a tug towards Judaism as a religion, and so I became probably the only Jewish Mexican American in El Barrio. And as a result of that, the ones who guided me and took me to synagogue were Holocaust survivors, all working class Holocaust survivors. And one in particular, Carl Hoffman, may he rest in peace, would take me to work with him. He was a plumber. He was what you needed him to be, to include illiterate in 7 languages. A brilliant mind, no formal education, with his tattoos, and he would tell me stories. Very reluctantly, but he would tell me stories and present me as his son, which made me very proud. And as a result of that, and then as a result of seeing the treatment of dark Mexicans versus light Mexicans, my mother has red hair, green eyes, and her sisters and brothers are dark, several of them. And so the treatment my tia Negra got was distinct when they went looking for apartments in El Paso. And so I grew up very early as being a witness and a victim of prejudice and racism. And so very early on, I think I developed a sense of empathy for the other. And I always felt, without knowing, that I was destined to do what I'm doing and to use my education, my talents, and my passion for others. I don't make a whole lot of money. I'm not starving. Hambre no me muero. But I'm happy, just like Marcela. I've learned that art is a film and it's based upon perception and passion. And Marcela really was able to capture the pain of these individuals, but the reality they're confronting, like I could never do if I lived to be 150. And so I think that we are formed by our early lives. And so what I always considered a curse ultimately became a blessing. And right after, and I was stationed of all places in Germany. I went to the camp, and after I got out of service in the Air Force, I immigrated to Israel and lived at kibbutz. And my first political experience was with this socialist kibbutz from the Russians from the 1890s. And my first introduction was Shalom Achav, or Peace Now, which is a very progressive movement. And so I've been around, and but I ultimately come home and say, Juarez is home, my family's here, my father passed away, but but I'm better here. I'm better off here, advancing the community I grew up in, and to stay because the need is great, and the fulfillment is greater.
Thank you, Carlos. I have a couple of questions from the audience. Helen Quinn asked, is authorized crime an established term in international law, particularly with regard to rights of asylum?
No, it's a term I've seen in pretty much used in the Nuremberg trials when the state becomes so powerful and the executive branch is taken over, takes over the legislative and judicial branch, and all control is in the executive branch, the courts and the police. Then that's when you have a full-blown case of authorized crime or fascism or authoritarian democracy, whichever you want to call it. But it's not an accepted word, but what I like about it, and we haven't won really many cases, or but maybe one without with the judge mentioning authorized crime as a reason. But what I notice is that in the summation, in the judge's decision, win or lose, they invariably, if you raise it, they mention authorized crime. And so what I learned is that really what authorized crime is a means of it's a means of explaining acquiescence by the state, and that is a legal term. So it's just another way of saying this is how acquiescence works in some context, in most contexts. And so I think that's been where the contribution is. Now, the other thing is that I have a friend, Samuel Schmidt, who's a well-known political scientist in Mexico, and his family is also from Poland, and they ended up in Mexico. And we've written a book called Authorized Crime, and it's getting ready to be, I think he's going to circulate that, and he's added a lot more theoretical threads to it that I'm capable of. I provide the facts, the cases, and the law, and he provides a analysis of violence and the role of the state, which is his forte.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question from Alberto Diaz-Calleros, director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford. Congratulations on the movie and the distinguished panelists. And Marcela mentioned violence is not random. Could you tell us more about the systemic victimization and who are the perpetrators? Are they intentional agents? Or should we see them more like victims themselves, even a sicario, of a larger process of an accountable state and organized crime?
Is that to, who's the question directed to? Is that for Marcela? Or for me?
Maybe both. Marcela, maybe, do you want to start?
I can start and Carlos can finish. I think we are all victims because we are living in something that it's not called, because it's not exactly academically a civil war, but it is a civil war because we are fighting one. I mean, if your neighbor is killing your sons or your mother or whatever, I mean, it's like a civil war. So we are all victims. Of course, a sicario is a victim. I'm not saying that they are the responsibles for all the violence that is occurring in Mexico, and that's what the movie once talks about. This is not about the sicarios. This is about the authorities. This is about Cienfuegos, who has been just captured now. He was the chief of the army. So I mean, if he is part of a cartel, or Garcia Luna, who was the chief of the national security, what can you expect? I mean, so sicarios are victims, we are victims. It's not them we are talking about. When we talk about authorized crime, it's not the sicarios that we are talking about. It's about the authorities, which, as Carlos says, the cartels changes, but the authorities are the same ones. So when I say that it's not random, that's what I say, that it's something that it's systematic and it's maybe not planned, but it is systematic.
You know, I think that that in general terms that almost everybody, to some degree, are victims, and that's a systemic violence against society. But in terms of the role of individuals in the systemic violence, is to play the role of collaborators, and some of it's intentional. In other is not intentional per se. For example, one of the things that really struck me in the town of Guadalupe, and that's the interesting thing about focusing on one town, because you're really looking at the dynamics, the institutional and governmental dynamics throughout society in one town. And when you focus on one town, you see things clearly. And when I started getting all these cases, many people were run out of their homes from Guadalupe. Why? They didn't sell it, they didn't rent it, they didn't live in it, they didn't use it as a stash house. They just made everybody leave. And this was basically done by the cartel without either the business community or the competitors of the businesses that left, or by the state arresting or trying to curtail this activity. And so what is it that the state or the corporations or the business community gets out of expelling, let's say, 80% of a town that was 17,000 when the war on drugs began, and there's 800 people left now? What do they get out of it? What they get out of it is control of space. And ultimately, there are strong economic interests in terms of pipelines coming from Texas into Mexico. One of the biggest bridges in the ports of entry as Tornillo, Texas, was constructed, which creates wealth in terms of property value. And to a degree that you can run people out, the big boys and girls really preserve their ability to expand their wealth and their property, while at the same time they let the criminals play with their little toys. And their toys are the ability to rape, plunder, and pillage the town, and nobody does anything because they can't. But they can't because it's organized in such a way where no resources are being given to the town to protect itself. And so it is an interesting dynamic, which I think has marked the historical brilliance of the corruption in Mexico, in terms of when you pay a mordida, when you're involved in drugs, everybody gets a piece of the pie. Of course, the big fish swallow the small fish and they get the bigger portion. But at the same time, how are you going to say someone's crooked if you're doing the same thing? And of course, if you turn someone in, then that's the mortal sin and you're gone. And so I think that for me, that's really what it is it's a free-for-all where everybody profits from the violence, except the victims and the majority of the people working class.
Thank you both. The pandemic is teaching us that we're resilient and that we can adapt to sudden changes. Look at us here on Zoom. The world has changed completely. Who would have predicted this a year ago? How can we use these stories to engage everyday Americans at the interpersonal level to challenge current views of incarceration, mass impoverishing, mass deportation, police brutality, voter suppression, all examples of racial violence? How also this powerful movie, what support do you have for this powerful movie to reach out and involve more people, both in Mexico and the US, and to both?
Marcela?
I think that we have to know what is going on. The first thing, well, I think that memory is resistance. So that's for sure. And also you have to know what is going on. You have to, but if you want to do something, first you have to know. And in Mexico, as I was saying, people doesn't know anything about Mexican migration. They didn't even know that there are Mexicans living in the United States seeking asylum. When I started to do the film, somebody asked me, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, this is this story about Mexicans seeking political asylum." And he said, "Political asylum in Mexico? Mexicans?" So it's like nobody knows here. And so that, I think that's the first thing that the film can, films, not only mine, And it's like the one that we were talking about in Netflix about Marcela Escobedo. You have to know. And the more emotional you approach to the subject, the more I think you get involved and commit. Because you le quitas los números, the stories or the deaths or violence. It's not only a matter of amounts or numbers. It's people, it's human beings living through these stories. So I think that makes more human all this speech and all this thing is it approaches the audience or whoever to the stories and to the story and to the what is going on. And that's not only for Mexicans, because I think in the United States people also have to know what is going on in Mexico, and not only in Mexico but also in Central America. And I think that also it's helpful for Mexicans because we are treating the same as Americans are treating Mexicans in the north border. Mexicans are treating Central Americans in our south border. So I think everybody has to, with this film or with another one, it doesn't matter, or going to the prisons and what you do with your students, anything, I mean, anything helps, and everyone has to do something from their trincheras.
You know, I think that we have to recognize that historically we are fortunate to be living through the golden age of Mexican documentaries. The documentary makers that I've met and the films that I've seen are incredible. And you have a new generation of which Marcela is an important part of that, have come to understand that the portrayal of reality of violence and injustice is an artistic responsibility to present without abandoning your art, and to the degree that you could represent it and to develop a story line about what people feel, what people think, how people react is important, because we're also living through a period of where violence and evil is normalized in Mexico and the United States. When I first started practicing law 30 years ago, some of the first clients I got back home from Mexico, and I asked them, have you been beaten up? Have you been mistreated by the Border Patrol? And they would say, no, nomás unas patadas y coscorrones. No, they just kicked me a couple of times. And that answers, and that plays into the what Marcela just said about political asylum. You know, Mexicans don't ask for political asylum. Number one, they don't know what it is. But to ask for political asylum, you know, what they do to me and to the neighborhood is to everybody. So it's like someone being in a concentration camp and not complaining, because who am I to complain if we're all going through it? And so it's this normalization of evil that we've seen aggravated by the dictatorial tendencies and efforts of Trump, who's really lowered us into the deepest levels of Dante's hell, along with the corruption in Mexico and the relationship between both countries. And the good thing is that there was a historic movement in both countries. And I think that this film, I wouldn't be talking to you if it wasn't for Marcela. We wouldn't be getting phone calls to have a discussion. And so I think the daily work and the daily passion will give rise to other passion by other individuals who can spread the word. So I think for those of us who are doing any type of work to include feeding the hungry, just keep doing it, and and when a new world where through Zoom and social media, the word is out there. I rarely engage in social media just because of my prejudices towards that, and I prefer Zoom is different. I like to see who I'm talking to, and so I think that I'll be zooming about a little more.
Thank you. Spreading the word and engaging everyday Americans, I guess, with this kind of movies, with art, with stories. This is what we need. And I want to talk about mental health, and I'm not talking about the trauma of the immigrants that escape hell in the South, just to arrive to hell in the North, but I want to talk about your mental health. How do you deal with secondary trauma, working with migrants that open up to you, trust you with their heartbreaking stories, have expectations that you're going to help them, but they continue hiding in detention, separated from their loved ones, or even deported?
Couple of things is that secondary trauma is a serious matter for people who do this type of work, either filmmakers or journalists or attorneys in this area, or even just in the area of immigration law during the Trumpian period. But one of the biggest problems we had is that our Mexican clients and most asylum seekers don't believe or understand what trauma is. It's a natural condition. And so one of the earliest problems we had was that in an asylum claim, you have to show harm. The harm can be serious physical and bodily injury or psychological. And so to prove psychological trauma and to treat it, you need a mental health provider. We don't have mental health providers really in El Paso, which led us to understand its need for them and then the need for us ultimately. And I'm happy to say that what we were able to do is to connect with ILEM, Instituto Latinoamericano de Familia in Mexico City, which is an organization, mostly women, of psychologists and mental health providers. And we got 19 of them to come to El Paso and begin talking to our clients, our members, and to then go back and continue doing it via internet. And when these Mexicanos receive Mexicanos and leave the country on their own dime and help them, that's probably the best thing that probably ever happened to them in their lives. A sense of pride, orgullo, and importance. And we continue that relationship. In fact, they have a good book, an interesting book that documents their experiences with us. Now, in terms of secondary trauma, it affected me so deeply over the years, in terms of driving me nuts, more so that I had cancer, throat cancer. It shut me up for like 6 months, which I survived, and I'm on remission and it's completely gone. And the doctor said there was nothing really biologically other than at that point being too fat and too engaged with alcohol to combat the physical problem. Most of it was stress. So I resolved that, and maybe 3-4 years ago, I had quadruple heart bypass. And I'm probably the best shape of my life now. But in the meantime, during that period, I was able to organize a relationship between psychologists and mental health providers and attorneys, not just to be expert witnesses in our hearings, to be able to extract the trauma. Many people have been either violated or sexually abused as children, and what happens to them in the camp obviously is impacted and aggravates that situation. So when you ask them point blank, if you've been abused, and without explaining what that is, or having a relationship with them, then no. So then you're left with no harm, which impacts the defense and the ability to stay. And so it's for me, it's a very important and interesting question you ask. And probably the most important thing that I've spent time with is trying to hook up mental health providers with asylum and immigrants in removal proceedings, because you have to show exceptional hardship or extreme hardship in proceedings. And the only damage, not the only damage, the major damage they have is psychological. But the judges again even looked at it as poo-pooing it and saying, kind of like, well, all Mexicans get mistreated, so what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that we're talking about an individual human being at the time. And so I think that mental health almost killed me, or the lack of mental health, and mental health is giving me a couple more years at least.
I have another comment from the audience. Marcela, thank you so much for your film, which makes visible our migrants and impunity. It is very important to show to the world this reality. Carlos, for you too, our gratitude and our recognition. We need thousands of people with your commitment. And this is from Nuria Gonzalez, Legal Research Institute, National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. We are running out of time. So I could continue with many more questions that I have, but I think I need to close, and then maybe, I don't know if some people can stay and ask more questions. It has been a delight and an honor to share this screen with you, Marcela and Carlos. And I ask everybody in the audience to watch The Guardian of Memory and to extend the invitation to your family, your colleagues, your friends, your students, your neighbors, to help them listen to the agency and courage of people leaving their land, their country, their memories. May we have a conversation about discrimination and racism that will open our hearts and challenge current policies. And I'm going to pass it to Elizabeth, and I don't know if we have more time for people that can stay longer.
Okay. Thank you, Vivian. Well, thank you, Marcela, Carlos, for this wonderful and informative conversation. And thank you, Vivian, for guiding it. And mostly thank you for the work each of you do from your own trincheras, from your own trenches. Before closing, I owe an apology to Marcela for mistranslating the word indignada as indignated. I don't think that word even exists. So I stand corrected. I think it's the translation should be outraged or indignant, I think. So thank you for correcting it. The audience corrected me.
But let me say, but that's the fronterizo in you coming out, because if we can't translate, we make up words. Debes de tener orgullo de ser del pueblo de la troca.
Sí. I was just commenting to Carlos that I'm also from Juarez. I'm actually close to Guadalupe, El Valle de Guadalupe myself. So that's anyway. But thank you for making us a guardians of memory and for infecting us with that indignation. And I just would like to remind everybody that the Guardian of Memory will begin its virtual release in our houses and cultural centers across the U.S. starting tomorrow. And for more information, you can go to the website, theguardianofmemory.com or epfmedia.com. And I think with that, we can probably close our broadcast, and we can stay a little longer